Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect, perfect. I'd like to welcome you all today. This is obviously, we are having our Leonard Baskin lecture today. This is our Stephen May and Kathryn B. Wilson lecture. I'd like to welcome our friends to the Farnsworth Art Museum, and as I like to say, our soon-to-be friends of the Farnsworth who are just joining us for the first time here in the auditorium this afternoon, or also via our live stream Zoom. My name is Gwendolyn Loomis-Smith. I'm the Phyllis Wyeth Director of Learning Engagement here at the Farnsworth, and I'm just thrilled to have you all with us today. We assembled a really special panel, so I'm glad you could all join us. I'd also like to thank you for supporting all of us here at the Farnsworth so we can bring you these discussions of art and culture that we love to present so much. And I wouldn't be here for the background work of the Learning Engagement team, so I just wanted to mention Alexis Saba, Kathryn Karlick, and our tech master today, Scott Sell, who will be running the hybrid platform in the back of the auditorium. Today, our Leonard Baskin panelists are here for our Stephen May and Kathryn B. Wilson lecture, which focuses on the art of the book, past and present. And we have Katie and her family joining us, as I should note online as well. Katie and her late husband, Stephen, had a vision and passion to ensure the future growth and accessibility of the Farnsworth Library, created through the bequest of the museum's founder, Lucy Copeland Farnsworth. The library, in fact, is the only publicly accessible library in the state of Maine that is solely devoted to art. Leonard Baskin's work, as many of you know, was both not only book-oriented, but also welcomed in a world of other influences, which impacted his artwork as a whole. And so today we are joined together by a wonderful group of panelists who will delve into some of the most meaty questions, and hopefully we'll have lots of answers too, and all sorts of interesting stories and thoughts about Leonard Baskin. We'll also have time for a Q&A at the end, and our moderator, Richard Aroneau, who I'll be introducing further in a few minutes, will be moderating those questions as well. Our panelists will include Ken Shure, Hosea Baskin, Stephen Hannock, and Aprile Gallant. Aprile Gallant, I'm going to turn this over to you as you are giving a little brief introduction for those of us who are new to Leonard Baskin, perhaps. Aprile Gallant is the Mary Walcott Kai's 1931 Curator of Prints and Drawings and Photographs and Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Smith College Museum of Art. And after Aprile gives us a brief introduction, we'll then meet our panelists. So again, thank you for joining us, and please welcome Aprile.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. So I am really pleased to be here, and thanks to Gwendolyn and Jane for inviting me to participate in this panel. In discussion with the organizers, we thought it would be useful to offer a few remarks on Leonard Baskin's work for those who are not familiar with the wide breadth and scope of his artistic practice. I do this with some trepidation. Although I prefer to speak extemporaneously, I've written out my remarks to preserve more time for the discussion so that everyone here can benefit from the depth of knowledge of my fellow panelists. Also, it's very hard to imagine cramming any insight into Baskin's prodigious creative output into 5 to 10 minutes, but that's what I will be attempting, so wish me luck. Although I've been a print curator for over 30 years and have direct knowledge of Baskin's prints and books, this knowledge is by no means exhaustive. I also did not know the artist personally, unlike my fellow panelists. Okay, all right. Okay, just to get closer to it. Okay. I can speak to a bit to Baskin's connection to Smith College, where he taught from 1954 to 1972. And this presentation features prints in the Smith College Museum of Art collection, many of which were donated by Baskin's friends, colleagues, and former students. Baskin's effect on the artistic community of Northampton, where Smith College is located, was also very profound. In addition to the decades worth of students who thrived under his tutelage, there remains a strong community of book artists and artisans in the area, which would not have existed without Baskin or the presence of the Gehenna Press. While I know that I will not do my subject justice, I'm happy to play a role in hopefully sparking discussion and opening curiosities about Leonard Baskin's work. Even after all this time, I still have many curiosities myself, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. First, a few historical facts. The son of a rabbi, Leonard Baskin was born in 1922 in New Brunswick, New Jersey. When he was 7, his family relocated to Brooklyn, and Leonard entered yeshiva, a conservative school of Jewish learning, where he began the rigorous studies that would develop his incisive thought processes, inspire him, and set him apart from mainstream American culture. Here is an image of an article on Baskin, which was published in 1964 in Life magazine. Baskin's presence in what is arguably the most important mainstream publication of its day is telling to the extent of his notoriety. And I really love this featured quote. Quote, "The world may see me as a nice, pleasant chap, but in my own view, I am a leper, an outlaw, a pariah." While it seems to fit well with the mid-20th century ideal of the artist as an outsider in society, Baskin's posture and approach seems very different to me, and to be the direct result of his extended years of study and eclectic process of self-directed training. It also serves as a means to establish Baskin's position as an outside observer, a chronicler and interpreter of history, and a critic of contemporary culture. It's important, I think, to remember that Baskin was first and foremost a sculptor. This is a work from the Smith collection, Man and Owl from 1959. And it was there that he first developed his carving skills and his interest in the human form. At the age of 15, he apprenticed himself to a Romanian-born figurative sculptor named Maurice Glickman. After leaving Glickman's studio, Baskin continued his studies at the NYU School of Architecture and Allied Arts for 2 years before transferring to Yale University in 1941. Yale seems to have been a turning point for Baskin, as it was there he deepened his engagement with literature, discovered the work of William Blake, and established the Gehenna Press, and taught himself to print books. His first book, printed in 1942, was On a Pyre of Withered Roses, which featured his own poetry and was not illustrated. Following 3 years of service in the US Navy during World War II, Baskin completed his BA at the New School for Social Research in 1949. During this time, he began to translate his carving skills into two-dimensional image making. This is a work from 1948 called The Lovers, a skill he would continue to refine during 2 years of study in Paris and Florence in the early 1950s. In fact, Baskin's first public exhibition of his prints was in Florence, Italy in 1951. Returning to the US, Baskin settled in Worcester, reinvigorating the Gehenna Press with the publication of A Little Book of Natural History in 1951, the first time his work with type and images would be combined. After teaching printmaking at the Worcester Art Museum and winning a number of printmaking awards in 1953, Baskin began teaching at Smith College, a position he held until 1974. While at Smith, Baskin taught sculpture, printmaking, and the book arts, a very tall order. In 1958, he established the Apiary Press, which published books designed, illustrated, and printed by students from both Smith and Amherst colleges. This proved to be a remarkable proving ground for budding artists such as Michael Mazer, and extended Baskin's quote-unquote learn by doing philosophy of teaching. In addition to his formal teaching, Baskin engendered what was known as the Free Academy, an informal system of apprenticeship at the Gehenna Press that drew on the individual and collective talents of Baskin, printer Harold McGrath, and binder Aroneau Werner. Throughout the next decades, Baskin continued to expand his work across printmaking. Here is a work, Hydrogen Man, which is featured in the exhibition. Books and broadsides, As Consequent, which focuses on the image of and the words of Walt Whitman. And sculpture. This is The Great Bronze Dead Man from 1961. On parallel yet distinctive tracks, Baskin continued to explore related themes throughout his work, which can also be seen in the exhibition here, where curator Jane Bianco has juxtaposed several of Baskin's monumental woodcuts with later sculptures. Even as Baskin expanded his repertoire of printmaking media, he maintained his connection to literature, depicting both well-known characters, here's a lithograph of Hamlet from 1971, and contemporary and historic literary figures, an etching of James Baldwin from the publication of his Gypsy and Other Poems. Characters from the Bible, here's Tobias and the Angel, art history, Lucas van Leyden, and classical mythology, Sybil, also abound. Although the 1964 Life article famously included a quote from Baskin saying that he did not depict images of women or use color in his work, this image of the Sybil refutes that point, as do many other works, including the Keening woman sculpture, which is in the exhibition. I was fortunate to be able to investigate this misconception further in a 2007 Smith College Museum of Art exhibition called Medea and Her Sisters, Leonard Baskin's Images of Women, which traced the appearance of female figures in Baskin's art from the early 1950s through the late 1990s. One final thing that has always interested me is Baskin's distinctive use of language. Those of you who have seen the exhibition on view have likely been struck, as I was, by the quotes from the artists that grace the walls. Baskin's words seem deeply entwined with his visual work, not only in the form of text he contributed to books, but as a way to navigate the complexity of the characters he depicts. I've often thought that Baskin's words slow the reader down precisely so we can engage in a struggle with meaning and experience the scholarly process that sparked the creation of his images. Baskin's attachment to the figurative, the literary, and books as vehicles of communication affirms the utility of history and the value, as he himself put it, to be modern in an age that denies the validity of the past, to be a humanist in the age that questions the value of man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, April. And as April mentioned, Jane Bianco is the curator behind the exhibition. So many of you have probably seen it already in the galleries. And if not, there'll be time after the lecture. You're certainly welcome to go upstairs as well to see the Leonard Baskin exhibition. Unfortunately, Jane could not be with us today, but I'm sure if she was, she'd be cheering us on to have all sorts of great conversation. And at this point, the panelists can proceed to the stage and then I'll introduce you. And I know, and I apologize, there's a little bit of a chair shuffle just to get everybody into position for the camera. So live theater here. They didn't know there would be moving chairs this morning, but because of the lighting, that was the easiest way to do it. As I said, a little bit of live theater, so appreciate your bearing with us here. Okay, so I would like to present to you, we have Ken Shure on the left-hand side, a rare book collector and dealer, fine press publisher at Two Ponds Press, and agent for the Gehenna Press, Leonard Baskin's private press, that is. Aprile Gallant, who you've met, who is the Mary Walcott Kai's 1931 curator of prints, drawings, and photographs, and associate director of curatorial affairs at the Smith College Museum of Art. And then we have Hosea Baskin, a former printer, antiquarian, bookseller, and an estate attorney specializing in cultural property who lives in Western Massachusetts. And then we also have Stephen Hannock, an internationally known artist of neo-luminist paintings. Stephen pursued his degree at Bowdoin, but through a 12-college exchange program found himself working as an apprentice to Leonard Baskin at Smith College when Baskin was a professor there. And then we also have moderator Richard Aroneau, who served as board president of the Farnsworth Art Museum for 5 years and is currently president emeritus and chairperson of the museum's Master Plan Initiative. So I'd like to welcome in the panelists, please. Give this to Ken first.
It's turned on. Okay, can I shut the screen? This? Put this down? Okay. Okay. April, thank you. That was a really remarkable 10-minute overview of a career, the kind of 10-minute overview that you can only present when you have had decades of experience exploring and deepening your knowledge of Leonard and his extraordinary work. I wanted to say that the experience of art at its best is a very personal thing. Even in an art museum, you come into a great public space, but you stand before a work of art and you engage in a dialogue with that work. And you have a relationship with that work. I think that's the paradox and the really remarkable power of being in a gallery in a public space. But imagine how deepened that experience can be if you also have a personal relationship with the artist. And that's the case for everyone here on the panel today. So that's the background of some of the questions I'm going to be asking, and I will direct them to one of the four of you remarkable men and women, but everybody can just jump in. The idea is that we want to have a conversation more than a back and forth with me, but you guys can speak to each other and the audience. After a few questions that I will toss out, we'll be open to questions from the audience, and also there are as many people on Zoom as there are in the auditorium at least, and they may have some questions if we have time too. Okay, so Kenneth, your experience with Leonard, your meeting of Leonard, I think was probably not an exaggeration to say it was life transforming for you and career transforming. Tell us how that happened, the genesis of it, and how it related to your subsequent interests in the Gehenna Press, and then beyond that, in your own press that you and your wife Leave have created these past 10 years.
Well, as you say, it was a decisive moment, I think, in my life, and probably in Leonard's as well, in terms of how his career with Gehenna Press evolved over the last 30 plus years of his life. I, in 1977, started an antiquarian book business in Rockport, moved to Lincolnville Beach in 1982, and one momentous day in August, this would have been 40 years ago this month, Leonard and Lisa wandered into my shop because our sign on the outside said ephemera, and being big collectors in that area, they were intrigued as to who were these people. And we instantly sort of had this rapport. I got invited, my partner Joe Riley and I got invited to the 60th birthday party in Little Deer Isle that summer. So it was 40 years ago this month. And I was introduced to his work, which I was largely ignorant of prior to that time. And I was intrigued by it. It was the private press movement was something that was peripheral in my vision, even though I was in the antiquarian book business. And Leonard opened my eyes to an entire new world of fine printing and typography, and within 2 years, I was visiting them, Leonard and Lisa, in their home in Devon in England. And then when they were in the process of moving back to the United States, Leonard said, well, you know, I you're a bookseller. Why don't you sell my books? And I said, well, okay. And I set off across the country. I was driving a car out to my sister, I believe, who was in the audience here tonight. And so I just loaded up with some of the back inventory of Gehenna Press. He gave me a list of people to stop along the way. And I did. And there was a book called Diptera, which was a book of flies and other insects. And one of the things I wanted to say is his Gehenna Press, you've seen his monumental woodcuts in the exhibition, but the Gehenna Press was, from monumental to minuscule. He was taking things and really experimenting with all different sizes and types of printing than the large woodcuts that you saw in the exhibition. And anyway, I sold several deluxe copies of Diptera, which I think broke the record for sales prices at the time. And he said, well, you're doing a pretty good job. Why don't you just become my agent? And that started off a long and wonderful connection. I, of course, realized that I also not only would sell his books, but I had to collect them myself. So I've built a rather large collection of not only his Gehenna Press books, but everything else that he worked in, particularly his graphic arts. That's how it all began.
Wow.
But I can tell you a little bit more about Gehenna Press if you want me to keep going. April sort of gave you a wonderful overview, but I just wanted to add a few things. And I've got a few notes here so I don't forget any of this long history. But it was the longest continually operating private press under a single owner in the 20th century. There were 2 bibliographies done of the press, one in 1976, another in 1992 that Hosea slaved over, and that still didn't encompass the entire run of the press, which wasn't finished until 2000 at the time of his death. And then there were still 3 or 4 books that were published under Lisa's direction posthumously. So, and people often ask, where did this Gehenna title come from? Well, there was a line in the first book of Milton's Paradise Lost, and it went, in black Gehenna called the type of hell. And that I think sort of nailed it. The plains of Gehenna were the areas outside of Jerusalem that were the dumping grounds. There was always fires and brimstone there. And the printing also had this references to the black arts, and the hell boxes where you threw the spent type. So here Leonard was in 1942, an undergraduate at Yale, and he later described his initial impetus to print as being under the influence of William Blake. And Blake was a major inspiration for the beginning of the press. And you showed a picture, or you mentioned his first book, which was On a Pyre of Withered Roses, which Leonard later described as being drenched in post-adolescent angst. And if you read it, you really get that. So that was 1942. Then the hiatus of World War II and study in Florence and the beginnings, and then the reactivation of the press in the early 50s in Worcester, then subsequently moving to Northampton when he was teaching at Smith College. But the interesting thing about the press is not just Leonard's imagery, but it was their, the topics that they covered, everything from art and social history, typography, the classics, from Euripides to Shakespeare, and most, I think importantly, his collaborations with other poets and artists, notably Ben Shahn, Rico Lebrun, Ted Hughes, and Anthony Hecht. And I think what sums it up best is Leonard's philosophy about his printing. He said that people like me who care about printing constitute the tiniest lunatic fringe in the nation. And I'm very proud to have been part of that lunatic fringe. And with the establishment of our own imprint, the Two Ponds Press, which you mentioned, we're continuing. My wife, Liv Rockefeller, and I are continuing to be at the forefront of the lunatic fringe.
That's great. On a Pyre of Withered Roses, that's his own.
That was his own poetry, yeah.
So he had at least a passing relationship with the Romantic poets at one point in his life, and maybe that's really remarkable in the light of so much of his ironic quotation later. Stephen Hannock is an accomplished artist in his own right with a growing reputation, but once upon a time you were an apprentice, I believe, of Leonard's, worked with him for a long time, many years, and were his friend. I think it would be great to hear about how that relationship, professional and personal, influenced your own work and helped to shape it.
Well, much the way Ken's career was changed by meeting Leonard, you'd have to say it was a seismic shift with regard to my situation. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to all my fellow Bowdoin polar bears out there, who's I have a dear, experience with that college. As a matter of fact, the museum recently acquired one of my Oxbow pieces that was painted in memory of Leonard and in honor of David Becker, my dear friend who was a Bowdoin alum. And sadly, we lost him a couple of years later, very unexpectedly to everybody. And I mention this because we're all here on stage as a really neat example of how Lisa and Leonard's home kind of generated this participation of people who were total lunatic fringe-ites. And this just continued. And one of the things that I'm really pleased to be here with April, because I remember getting a phone call from David Becker, who was really excited when he heard that April had been given this position at the Smith College Museum, which was my home museum, thanks in many ways to Leonard, but it was actually the museum that gave me my first museum show, as Bowdoin gave Leonard his first museum show. So there were a lot of dots being connected that were really, really very emotional and very important in the way we live day in and day out. With that said, I was going to be a professional hockey player. I mean, we can't hide from that. I mean, and as a number of our friends here know, when I got out of high school, I was sent by college hockey coaches to Deerfield Academy, which is a boarding school. It's a very difficult school to spend an extra year, and they had a terrific hockey program. Of course, I wasn't prepared with, the reading assignments that you normally get for a semester. You had to do in a week at this place, and that was pretty tough. But it's also the place where I took my first art class since fourth grade. As you might imagine, the way the college athletics are set up, the college coaches don't want you taking culture classes because they think it looks like you're padding your curriculum. So I went out of my way not to take any art from fifth grade through high school. And I was here at this place and met Dan Hodomarski, a terrific artist, resident of Deer Isle, Maine, who said, "You got to be crazy. I mean, this place is so difficult. Nobody's going to give you a hard time, but, skipping out, you got to take art." Took art, went to Bowdoin the next year to skate, and we had a terrific hockey team. There was no art department at Bowdoin at the time. And so I looked into this event. They had this program called the 12 College Exchange, where I could go for one semester to any number of colleges to study art. And I figured, well, I was familiar with Northampton. So I said, well, let's try Smith. And our friend Glenn Kaplan heard I was going to Smith. He goes, "Oh, you're going to study with Leonard Baskin." Who? Yeah, "You don't know Leonard Baskin?" Well, he proceeded to read me the riot act. And of course, I was totally fried before I even spent the next fall in Northampton. And first class, I was the only man in the class. And Leonard came in, he was very nice to all the women, and he just busted my chops right off the bat. "You suck. You can't draw to save your life." What is that? That's not what a man looks like. And then he'd walk out there and I go, gee, I was just crushed. And then he wouldn't show up for a few weeks. And so I just dropped out of the class. This is crazy. And I'm looking, when does hockey season start? This is, And I started working on a sculpture in the room outside. This is in the chemistry building because they were building this new art facility that they have at Smith now, but that wasn't complete at the time. And Leonard would come through on his way to go to class when he would show up. And we just started hanging out, and he looked at the sculpture I was doing. And after a few months, he goes, you know, I'm about to start a series of Shakespeare projects with the Gehenna Press. Would you be interested in cutting the woodcuts, my drawings out of blocks of wood? And I said, sounds like fun. That sounds pretty cool. Yeah, I'd like to do that. And we just started working together in that room. Then he would invite me to the studio where we would work on everything from, I would be sweeping the floor, and he would just be speaking about how you make art while you make art. And it was spellbinding. And what was really curious is the grasping of how similar the thought process of an athletic achievement is to that of making art. There's just endless rehearsal, practice. You practice your entire life. And then at that moment where the art is executed, you just have to jump on it. And Leonard's teachings to me, if you will, were right in sync with that. But he was really entertained by I have to tell you that I grew up outside of Albany, New York, across the street from a Jewish family. And I love these guys are my oldest friends on the planet. And we went everywhere together. I have to confess, I was their mother's worst nightmare because I wouldn't respond to any of her guilt trips that would send these kids into their room for 3 days. And it just would sort of bounce off of me for whatever. But I learned a few words of Hebrew. And Leonard and I were driving someplace up in Hadley, and he was talking about his brother was a rabbi and his father was a rabbi. And so I said a few words in Hebrew, and I've never seen this man come so close to crying in his life. A combination of how pathetic the Hebrew was with also, you know, he was just crying. He was laughing so hard. And I'm going, what? What's the big deal? You know, and he goes, I never thought I'd live to see the day when a WASP jock would try to speak Hebrew. I went, yeah, okay, fine. So anyway, that is basically how that happened. And one last thing I'd like to add is in the introduction of us up here, one of the things you mentioned is that my friend Hosea Baskin was also Leonard's son. So let's just get that in there. Just a small thing. Who is one of the kindest, most amazing men I have ever met. Who was a total nightmare as a 2-year-old. I'm not going to get into the stories right now, but I know his kids are here. If you want to come up, and I'll tell you some of these stories, and they're true, you know. So with that in mind, Hosea, welcome.
You're most kind. You're most kind.
First of all, before your end, would you like to speak some Hebrew? You know, I have about 14 follow-up questions, but we'll be here all night, so I'm gonna reserve them for the next seminar. Hosea, you've been outed as Leonard's son already, so I'm not going to worry about whether I have to get into a Reichian thing here with you. But you are someone who grew up or were brought up in Leonard's home. You knew the man, you knew him as a father, you knew him as a teacher, as an artist. What I'm wondering is, how did that impact your own choices in life and in your career and in your book collecting?
Well, I'd have to say the day I met Leonard was one of the most significant days. Well,
Do you remember that day?
vividly. Leonard, let's see. growing up around him was remarkable. He was, he had an almost infinite patience and tolerance for children, something that he did not always have for adults. He created a remarkable, he and Lisa, my mother, created a remarkable environment in which to grow up. It was an environment that placed a huge emphasis on aesthetics, on beauty. I was dragged to more than my fair share of museums and antique shops and galleries and bookshops, and the list goes on. And there comes a point where you're deeply immersed in that environment and you have two choices. One is to, embrace it, and the other is to, I don't know, become a mechanical engineer or something, run the other direction. And I embraced it. And after college, I started mucking around with printing presses in high school, which I'm sure I would not have done if it weren't for him. And I mean, I had spent time as a child around the press. I liked the smell of printer's ink. And after college, I was a little bit at loose ends, and I went home to work on a project with him. There was a book that he wanted printed, and there was a press set up in a part of the barn that we had sort of converted and insulated into a press room. And the project ended up taking 3 years because it involved, as he liked, some mind-bending typography. He loved to play around with the shape of words on a page, and it's all well and good when he's, drawing the shapes on a piece of paper, but when you actually have to set the type in circles and pyramid shapes and such, it's enough to drive you mad. Draw your own conclusions. So it was a fun 3 years. It was during that time I also worked on the bibliography of the press that Ken mentioned. And it was really fun to work with him. It did make it easier that he was happy to edit text for the sake of shape. I'd go to him and say, this is working great, except this word is too long. And he'd, delve deep into his ridiculously large vocabulary and pluck out a perfect but slightly shorter adjective. And the shape would work. So it was a pleasure to work with him. The title of the book, it was a book called Jewish Artists of the Early and Late Renaissance. And he loved to muck around with art history. His knowledge of art history and the little traveled corners of art history was incredibly comprehensive. And he would come across problems, bodies of work that we didn't know who the artist responsible was or who the connection between this artist and that artist was. So he'd make someone up. And he'd write these little biographical essays about these created artists who were, and the information in these essays was a combination of the true but unbelievably obscure and the made up but not disprovable. And then he'd publish, an edition of 26 copies, and these books would go off into the dark corners of libraries around the world where they'll sit quietly like a ticking time bomb, and 200 years from now, some poor innocent art historian will discover the book, and it'll be hard to disprove what he has put into them. But you know, his idea of a good time was the most elaborate jeu d'esprit that you can imagine. So yeah, it was fun. After 3 years, I realized that the same part of my brain that made me a good printer would have driven me absolutely mad if I had stayed as a printer. I didn't need to do something that really let my worst obsessive compulsive tendencies have free reign. And letterpress printing, if ever there was something that gave your OCD full reign, it's letterpress printing. So with the help of a nice nepotistic connection, I went off to Sotheby's in London and learned to be a rare book dealer. And you know, as well as an artist, Leonard and Lisa as well are obsessive book collectors. And so I ended up in another endeavor that was, again, very near and dear to their hearts, and I suspect reflects their influence sometimes more than I'd like to admit. So that's a good place to wrap that.
I think you admitted it very nicely.
Thank you. Thank you.
April, I've already spoken about how wonderful your summary, your overview of Leonard's career was, kind of like 10-minute Shakespeare, 37 plays. But you also had, you knew Leonard and you knew his work. And I'm wondering about the way that those two intersected in your experience of that work. And also, what's Leonard's legacy today at Smith and in Northampton?
Oh, well, that's a small question.
Well.
Yeah. Actually, I did not know Leonard. So I met him once. It was at a dinner after a gallery opening at June Fitzpatrick's gallery in the late 1990s. But I, of course, was aware of the work, which made me just reverent enough to be completely paralyzed. I was young and was, you know, sort of starstruck because, you know, anyone who loves prints and books knows about Leonard Baskin. I was raised by a mechanical engineer. So I don't know how I joined.
The other direction.
Yes, exactly. I don't know how I joined the lunatic fringe, but sometime in high school, I decided that I was passionate about books and that I wanted to involve myself with books and tried desperately to learn how to print and bind books and was horrifically terrible at it. So I went the other way, is that instead of like having no hand skills, I decided I would be a curator and an art historian, so that I could spend time with the people that made these objects. So I only met him once, but as you said, his shadow at Smith looms very, very large. I think there is no way that, you know, the art department at Smith would be what it was if it hadn't been for his presence. And then also just talking to a number of his former students who speak with him with great reverence. He was completely inspirational to them. And a lot of it was because he really inspired by doing and expected a lot of them. I mean, someone actually said that, you know, to the students that had no talent, he was exceedingly kind. But if he thought you had something, he would be very demanding and he would push you and press you. And they loved it. They were really hungry, I think, for someone to believe in them as an artist, and to have someone like Leonard Baskin, you know, criticize you seemed an honor. And so he really, like, he pressed them. Like I remember someone telling me that for the Aprile Press, which is the press he founded to teach students to make books in 1958, it was mostly just about, you know, here, you know, your project is to publish a book. And the only stipulation is it can't be something that was previously published, because as someone said, nobody wants a bunch of student copies of sonnets to the Portuguese, like copy after copy after copy. But to be charged to learn by doing and to sort of figure it out yourself, but with someone there to kind of like point you in the right direction, I think is an enormously important way to learn. I mean, he was very self-directed himself as a learner. I mean, it's very interesting to think about his, his training. Much of it, started as an apprentice to a sculptor, and then teaching himself how to print books. It's sort of amazing, I think, to kind of have that level of curiosity and drive and confidence, and to be able to work so hard to make it just, I mean, I love Steve's likening it to sports performance, because I've always thought, looking at his carving skills, that you have to work really hard to make that so fluid that your hand knows what you're doing. Like, it's almost like he would think something and the hand would act on its own, that it was instinctual by the point of making a lot of those woodcuts, which is truly extraordinary. And then to see him work in so many different media, and with such great facility. And then the writing, I love the writing. Like, that is one of my favorite books about the forgotten Jewish artists, because it really is so, it's so brilliant and so just inspiring. And I think, very, very funny. And to have someone who has that level of talent, as well as humor and insight and drive, and being able to apply it to so many different arenas, is extraordinary. So I think, unfortunately, sometimes, museums and art history don't quite know what to do with the work, because it is broad and deep and challenging. Like, you don't just look at a Baskin work and even you can sort of absorb it passively, but you also can spend an awful lot of time digging deeply into every single layer. It's challenging work, and I think that is its real benefit. And so I think, he challenged his students. And then also, as I said very briefly in my remarks, that Northampton or the Pioneer Valley would not have the depth of engagement with the book arts if it hadn't been for the Gehenna Press. Many people would come from all over specifically to work with Baskin or to observe, and then all the apprentices that went through the Gehenna Press and learned by doing. So learning by doing, I think, is sort of an extraordinary way to teach. And also, I love the fact that David Becker has been invoked, because he was enormously important to me as a mentor, and he was very much inspired by Baskin. So yeah, I don't think David Becker would have found his intellectual focus, which was Brezna, had it not been. Yeah, I can imagine. So I feel very indebted to Leonard Baskin, although I only met him once, for inspiring so many of the people that have enriched my life. And I like to think that, it's not 6 degrees of Leonard Baskin, it's probably fewer, because I think almost anyone that is engaged with books or printmaking has some connection to Baskin and his work.
That's great. Thank you, Aprile. Before we open the questioning to the audience, I just have one more question for all of you, and it's about the current exhibition. There's a quote at the beginning on the wall from Ted Hughes, who I think was a friend, I know was a collaborator of Leonard's, and it talks about the grand dimension of feeling. I'm wondering if you would be willing, able to talk about your response to this exhibition in the grand dimension of feeling, and in the place where aesthetics and emotion really coalesce into an experience of art that's quite extraordinary and maybe not that easy to talk about. But go ahead.
Well,
You start.
Yeah, I'll start, because I'm the one with the least to lose. I took slap shots to the head, so I've got an excuse for stuttering here. But first of all, with regard to this show, April brought up a really good point with regard to how you absorb art, through publications and stuff. It's pretty much the only way you get a chance to see these things. And if you didn't know Leonard very well, you see his books, not only the Gehenna Press books, but also the exhibitions of his catalogs. But you can never get the impact of these true monumental woodcuts until you stand in front of them. I was just telling Hosea that, I've seen these prints for 50 years, and this show really rattled my cage because I'm always seeing these things thumbtacked to the wall with the paper flopping along, or if they're framed, they're on the floor leaning against the wall. I've never seen a collection of these monumental prints hung on the wall where they truly do have their monumental impact. They're towering over us, and each one has the space. I think Leonard, don't you think he would have been pleased with the space in between them? He was a stickler. He despised cramming too many images in there for the sake of showing images, unless you gave each one the space. And we have that going on in here. And that, I think, is something that we really want to appreciate while this show is here, and tell people about it, because they're not looking at the books about it isn't going to do any good. It's when you tell them what the impact of these individual pieces standing in front of them is where the real impact goes. Now it's your turn.
Thank you, Steve. I think that what hit me the most was seeing the late series of 6 Holocaust woodcuts up on the wall together. And it was a subject that Leonard really grappled with and struggled with. Rico Lebrun, who's been mentioned a few times, was an artist who Leonard felt was a compatriot, fighting the fight for figurative art at a moment when abstraction and pop were dominant. And Rico's death in the 60s was a huge blow to Leonard. He felt that he lost a fellow fighter in that struggle. But Rico said that any artist who doesn't deal with the Holocaust in some fashion is not addressing the central human event of our era. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something like that. And Leonard struggled with that a great deal. How can you possibly compete with the documentary images of the Holocaust, the piles of bodies, the photographs? And he finally, towards the end of his life, came to it through, he started writing these aphorisms, quite dark. No, more than quite dark, very dark, quite wry. And he came to that late series of woodcuts through the texts that he wrote. And it was interesting what you were saying about his writing. And the aphorisms, the mottos, sort of allowed him a doorway through which he could address the Holocaust. And it's a very powerful series of woodcuts. Some of them are quite hard to look at. And to see them framed in a row on a single wall where you can take in their impact at once it's a powerful and disturbing and profound experience. And that was what hit me the most in the show. Over to you.
Thank you, Hosea. Yeah, actually, I agree. Like, I had not seen all of those together, but I really also appreciated juxtaposing the late Holocaust woodcuts with the early monumental woodcuts, which are works that I've always loved. And so that you're able to really, I mean, obviously the art historian in me loves to kind of see the connections across time, very, sort of different works and yet related, because there's a lot of the subjects, even though his work was so broad and in very many different media, there are these underlying threads that sort of weave through the books and the woodcuts and in the sculptures as well. So it was really nice to be able to have some sculpture in as well, but I really appreciated having those two bodies of work in close proximity. And then having the words on the wall. Like I really loved being able to see some of his words in relation to some of the woodcuts.
Hosea basically took the words out of my mouth. I was going to quote the Rico Lebrun as well, because that Leonard had always said that to me about, how does one deal with the horrors of the Holocaust? So aside from that, which I totally agree with, I think another interesting aspect of the exhibition is the ability to see the woodblock from which the prints were pulled and the color variations. Those ones in red that we see there were very, very few ever pulled that way. So it really gives you a whole different perspective on a print to see it just in black and white and then in a different color. So I think that was that was rather striking to me, but obviously agree with everything else that was said. And just to conclude though, one thing, we've been focusing a lot on his private press, the Gehenna Press, but one thing we haven't really mentioned is his prodigious output as an illustrator in trade books. There was an entire series, one of which I believe won the Caldecott Prize, the Hosea series. There was the Hosea Zoo, the Hosea Aviary, the Hosea Alphabet, thank you. And then a whole series of anchored Doubleday paperbacks that he designed back in the 50s, along with Edward Gorey and other artists who were, doing that as a sort of a side gig. And then the Haggadah, which is, I think, the most widely distributed Haggadah in history. So there was that whole aspect of him as not only a fine press person, but as an amazing illustrator. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Well, we're going to open this up. First of all, if you haven't seen the exhibition, it is open after this conversation ends. So I really would urge you to, it's not a big show, but it's a very big show. So try to see it for sure. And this is a very low-tech Q&A. You just raise your hand and I'll try to call on you. And I will try to repeat the essence of your question so that the Zoom audience can hear it as well. Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to go back to that quote. I am a leper. I'm a pariah. I'm not sure what it was, but that quote. And I want to ask Kofi, because I live with one of those pictures that's in the show, and I look at it and I think there was some potential deep self-loathing in your father. And I wonder about it all the time in everything I see that he did, particularly that piece and some of the other big pieces that we have. To talk about what was going on.
You want to repeat it before I answer?
I think you were loud enough that it was heard.
Okay.
And I could.
Yeah. I can't imagine what he would have been like had he not had the art as a place to put all of that. He was not like his art. People have this sort of image of him as, or an expectation that he must have been, dark and morose and death haunted. And he was mostly a rollicking good time. But the quote, I think that he saw himself in almost every respect as standing somewhere between, at a remove from, and in opposition to the prevailing culture of his time. I think he felt that way aesthetically. I think he felt that way politically. In that fashion, he definitely did see himself as a leper and a pariah, and belonging to a lunatic fringe in any number of ways. But I don't see a reflection of self-loathing. I think that he was trying to explore in a serious fashion the nature of what we collectively are and do as humans, And I think the conclusions he drew were fairly dark, though not without hope. I think if loathing is a funny word, but much about humanity troubled him. And I think with good reason. How can one have lived through the 20th century and not be troubled by what we got up to? But I think that the art, while dark, did hold out hope, and that his art was capable of both horror and beauty, and sometimes the beauty is in the rendering of the horror, and that inherent contradiction in to see something that you find disturbing as a work of art, and yet to also acknowledge how gorgeously rendered that flayed flesh is. That's the contradiction that is him and his work.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, go ahead, Joyce.
They love that our world march. We read the signage together, and they saw so much of the present day, their present day of living through the Ukraine and the horrors of watching that on nightly news, and the awfulness of all of that just gives me the shivers thinking of these families that have been, broken apart and forever, taken away from their countries and everything. So I felt that them, it was very much a reflection of now and the darkness of what we're living through. And they didn't seem freaked out by it at all, all that, I've talked to other people who've seen the show, and they concentrated on the darkness, whereas the boys didn't. The boys were very engaged with what's happening and wanting to, they were very moved by it.
It's really interesting and validating that you say that, because I spoke with Jane early on in the planning, and she really found it very compelling work, but she was concerned that there might not be an audience for it because it was too dark. And as it's turned out, it's been the most popular exhibition this summer by far. And if you come into the galleries on a sunny or a rainy day and walk around the museum, that's where the people are. And people, I think, have a way of relating it to their own experience, whatever that is, and their understanding of our times, not just the 20th century, but the 21st century. And it's powerful.
I think one of the many gifts that Leonard had was, even while depicting something so horrific, unlike photographic images that we're all conditioned to digest, he was able to create art that had a great deal of mystery. And it's that mystery, I think, that occupies a lot of spaces that I bet you your son is aware of. And that provides the space for your own imagination to take off and imagine these different capabilities coming from these images. I mean, that's the goal of most artists, to create a work of art that says something, yet allows for that mystery for the viewer to participate is to whatever extent they want to. It's very difficult to do, and Leonard was the master.
Just a quick comment, which is, it's not my role, but quick comment. One thing I think you share wonderfully with Leonard is the way in which you actually use words to amplify the images.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's
it's true.
well, Yeah, yeah. Actually, there's a piece of mine upstairs that will soon be part of this collection. I'm quite honored to have that happen. And what I do is I paint these vistas, but they, rather than painting a place, I set a stage for stories that come to my mind. I literally write these stories through there. And if you see the piece of Mount Katahdin, you'll recognize a number of people from this community actually written into that painting. But that's how it goes. It's
Yes, go ahead.
But I'm interested in some of the technical aspects. Since we have people who worked in the studio with him, you know, some of the monumental prints, like the technique of actually working with a piece of wood that size, and how sort of maybe innovative his use of papers were. And you said he was self-trained, so how much of it was trial and error, and how much was he taking from Japanese printmaking tradition and that sort of thing.
So the question is about the technical aspects of the work.
Steve worked on it.
Yeah.
yeah.
I look younger.
Yeah, right. Oh man, I have so many stories of Hosea right here, right, and they're all wonderful. I mean, I love this guy. All kidding aside, but one of the things that Leonard was, he was a taskmaster, as April has indicated. You had to learn how to draw, and he really, boy, he would beat me up on some days, and I would work from anatomy books, equine anatomy as well as human anatomy, over and over again. And I do some great drawings. And he'd look at him and he'd go, you're getting it. It just wasn't that. But I remember the day when it clicked and I could draw the human skeleton without even looking at the paper. All the proportions would just come out, and I'm in a fluke of nature. I happen to be ambidextrous, so I'd be drawing with both hands, and that really created all this other stuff. But what Leonard celebrated in a remarkable way that I learned front and center was that you draw spontaneously on the block. That's the first stage of it. You do the drawing on the block, and then the second stage is interpret that drawing with the knife, with your gouges, whatever. And that's a spontaneous event. And it's never more apparent or celebrated as in the Gehenna book, one of my favorites, the Ancatatas, which is a collaboration he had with the great Rico Lebrun. Leonard thought he was the greatest draftsman in one of the greatest draftsmen in the history of art. And it's tough to dispute that. But Rico would do the drawings of these turtles. And then Leonard, it was his honor to cut them out of this block. And it's a magnificent book. And that whole process is very much learned. You're flying by the seat of your pants. There's just no way you have to learn that by doing this. And then when it's done, the act of printing is a whole other thing that's just really hard to do. You rolling the ink. If there's too much ink, you fill in all the details. And Leonard had this uncanny gift for celebrating. We were just talking about this in front of his paintings of celebrating these open, pure, dark areas, these black surfaces juxtaposed with open white areas, and in between these delicate celebrations of just minute, absolute, remarkable dexterity at cutting these out. And that combination created these works that are Leonard. And I haven't seen anybody duplicate that sort of menagerie with that sort of strength. And that's where a lot of that mystery comes from. So you got to get that ink rolled on there just right. And with the monumental pieces, he had a giant roll of tea bag paper. It was the same paper they make tea bags out of. And you put the giant roll on the woodcut at the bottom, and you roll it out for 6, 8 feet, 9 feet. And then Harold McGrath would use a gouge handle that he rubbed so much that it was flattened to this perfect 2-inch space that created this perfect tool. And if that piece was lost, it was known that you would be hanging from one of the rafters at the end of the day. And but at the end of the print, and it took me a while to get as proficient at this as Harold McGrath was. First of all, your hands are crippled by the end of the day, but one side of the print was as dark as the other side of the print. And that's what really made these things so impressive. And one of the difficulties of this was the tableau rice paper has a lot of acid in it. And you needed to frame these really soon to keep the air away from these things, because I have a manna piece that was stapled to my wall for decades that looks like it was printed on brown wrapping paper. It's just decayed that much. And then the pieces that Hosea and Ken were talking about, the Holocaust series, they were printed on, I think it was the Kelly, wasn't it the big Kelly? Oh, okay. Oh, Herb did those. Okay. Oh, wow. I'd love to see those. But they were printed on a Japanese rice paper that did not have this acid. And you can see how they've retained their punch. The reds are red and the contrast is just magnificent. That's in a nutshell, that's kind of how the printing process we worked with.
Any questions? Yeah.
No. Engravings were run through a press. The end grain carvings that he did a lot of, but the woodcuts, particularly the monumental ones, we had big presses, but there's no way you could print them. You could also crush the blocks very easily.
Do we have an online question? Yeah, go ahead.
Nobody else.
I think, as April mentioned, Leonard was the son of a rabbi. His brother was a rabbi. Leonard attended yeshiva. He was drilled in the tenets of Judaism, which often will lead you to question. And I think that is what he did. And I think he questioned the tenets of Judaism as his life went on. An interesting side story, so I can further avoid answering this, but is that he was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in the same hospital that I was born in. His father was the rabbi in the congregation that my grandfather was in. We discovered this later in life, that we had this kind of connection. But certainly that his intensive education, early education in Judaism had a very strong effect. Obviously, he spoke, I think, fluent Yiddish. He was well versed in it, but I don't think he wanted to be categorized as a, quote, Jewish artist. He was really an artist who would express elements of his Judaic background, but in his own really unique way. That's about as much as I dare say.
Anyone else on that subject?
It's a complicated question. I mean, Leonard was fond of saying that the two greatest Jewish artists were Rembrandt and Kathy Kollwitz, neither of whom were Jewish. What does it mean to be a Jewish artist? And he definitely, it influenced him. It was part of what created his sensibility, his intellect, but at the same time, it was something that, and one could even say that there is nothing more profoundly Jewish than to be ambivalent about Judaism. it was a profound influence. It was a complicated relationship. And he was an atheist. Yes, that's it. Yes, I think he would have said that there's no better breeding ground for atheism than the yeshiva.
Do we have other online questions, or can I take one more from the audience? Last question from the audience. Yes.
Going to April's, I sat in class. I remember learning routinely reducing students to peers. And I asked them about that. First, I said, the tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of destruction. And that was really telling. I mean, he really believed in getting people angry. It's a lot that telling you what to do. He did it routinely. He got people off the rails. The second goes to the language. Again, what he said. The road to success, the roads of success leads to the palace of wisdom. Whatever that way goes. Something.
I think so.
The road is definitely the way.
Yes.
And that goes to the language. His favorite adjective is fussy. I recommend you look it up. But if anyone was a fussy prose writer or speaker, it was Leonard, and you cannot read a paragraph of Leonard's prose without knowing it's Leonard. I mean, it's unique to him. It's like reading the King James Bible. And the third, although you probably don't know this, Leonard was closet Dodgers. He loved Branch River from reading Higher Jack and Robbins in 1938. I think that was the best thing in his life. And another great people, Branch River had many things. Leonard's favorite was success is that place in the road where preparation is opportunity. And that speaks, I think, to his work, which was amazing. I mean, it was non-stop. You could wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, Monday to the other, farm printing. And to work in the number of mediums, to do them all extremely well. I would say, especially Woodington, because he, I think, basically reinvented that as a medium for artists. Nobody had really treated Woodington the way Leonard did. And lastly, you know, I'm glad somebody mentioned Harold McGrath, because Leonard would routinely refer to Harold as his right arm. You know, Leonard could design, but Harold could execute. And to print a wood engraving, I have a make ready that Leonard did the engraving, Harold made the make ready. It took them all day to make it. It's 21 thin pieces of paper made out.
Their works of art all on their own, aren't they? That's.
No, he was so fortunate to have Harold working as his partner. He really was a cool partner. So I just wanted to bring Harold in this discussion because it was Gehenna Press without Harold.
So out of those last comments, I want to try to draw a question, which is about Leonard. What was Leonard's teaching technique? Was his attitude toward his students? Was his toughness on his students? Did it work? Was it effective?
It's not a student.
I would say the students that I've spoken to, absolutely. Like I said, many of the Smith students, former Smith students that I talked to, like responded, you know, beautifully to it. They wanted to be challenged. I mean, I think, you know, if you are a college student and you're studying with an artist, you want to be treated like an adult, and he did not pull any punches with them. I mean, although it was interesting to hear that that to the students with no talent, supposedly he was exceedingly kind, that he did not press them, but those, so it was kind of an honor to have him rake you over the coals. But I'll pass it on to Stephen.
Yeah. He wasn't easy on you. Was it good for
Oh
you?
boy, he was really tough, and it all depended on how well his own work was going on a given day, to how with regard to that impact. But to reiterate, drawing was everything. you had to learn how to draw. And to April's point, if you couldn't draw, you were in this area where he was very kind and patient, like, oh, that's good, try this or do that. But he would always say, what he would tell me is that there's no way I can teach you how to be an artist, but I might be able to help you to learn on your own, because you have to do this on your own. And what I learned was, everybody in college wanted to be a filmmaker, an artist, or an actor, or the culture arena is very appealing. But you hit 35 years old and everybody quits. Everybody's gone, and you look around, and nowadays I look around, and the survivors that are left embrace that as a form of celebration. Just the mere act of survival is really a celebration, because we've all come through that learning process that's all been on your own. And teaching, the way you hear these adages say, oh, those who can do, those who can't teach, nothing could be more polar opposite than the reality of the situation. One of my dear friends and champions is the recently late Wayne Thiebaud, who we lost last Christmas. And he was teaching, he died at 101 years old. He was teaching at Cal Davis freshman drawing when he was like 94, because he wanted to get to the kids before they got ruined. That was his remark. But the idea of exhibiting that patience that April is talking about is very tricky. It's very different from the thought process that goes on when you're making art. And that's all artists want to do, is bring to life these ideas. So for him to kick back and get into that teaching mode was tricky. And the last thing I'll say about this is that he really preferred to have one apprentice there that would just take it on the chin and see life on the front lines of the art wars firsthand. That's how you gain that. And we were all in a succession of apprentices. And I need to point out that Michael Kutch, who is his most recent one, Leonard really learned a lot from with regard to color. And I have to mention, Ken has just sort of mentioned that he and Liv have this Two Ponds Press. It's a magnificent entity, and I'm honored to I'm finishing a book that we've been working on for 15 years that I collaborated with Sting. It's his lyrics, my woodcuts, and we're about to start a new publication that is a companion piece to my Mount Katahdin painting upstairs. I did the preparatory drawings from a bush plane bouncing around at like 500 feet through wind currents that are just absolutely insane. But this is how you learn. You learn this from the front lines, just doing it. It's beyond art classes. And that's sort of where the tough love came from with regard to Leonard. If you were there part-time, he was very friendly, very kind. But if you wanted to play, you take off the gloves, and
that might be a great last line.
I just have one.
Yeah.
I just want to offer a little consolation door prize to all of you who ventured out on this beautiful summer Sunday when you probably would have rather been on the golf course or at the beach to hear us pontificate about Leonard. Anyway, I brought a selection of Gehenna Press prospectuses of books that are long out of print, but they have examples of some of his press work, some of his printing in them, and I'll have them up here on the stage. Feel free to take them. If you go on eBay, you have to pay $25 a piece for them, but they're here free for you today. So thank you all for coming.